You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 30, covering the week of June 6th through June 10th, 2016. Glad to have you back on the program, and we've got several good pieces to talk about this week. Of course, next week is our summer school in Seabrook Island, South Carolina, and then in August we have got our conference in Atlanta, Georgia, August 13th on Nullification. And we're working on something for October, too, going out to Texas. So we'll have some information about that when we get everything solidified and who's going to be speaking and whatnot. So, glad to have you back on the program. Of course, this week there was some news that the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. has decided to remove the stained glass flags, Confederate flags. They're going to leave Lee and Jackson on the windows, but they're going to take the flags out. Again, this was expected. This has been in the works for a while, and the push to do that had been ongoing. So I just think it was a matter of time before it happened. And we'll address some issues like that with two pieces this week. We've got a couple of interesting pieces that are a break from the assault on Southern symbols, but we do have two, and one has mentioned something that I brought up before on the program, so that's the piece we had on Monday. So we'll start with that. The title of the piece is, "Oh Say Can You See, Another One Bites the Dust," and it's written by David McAllister. And David McAllister is a active participant in Florida, engaging in saving Southern symbols from politically correct attacks. And what he mentions in this piece, I think, got a lot of people interested. And that is that he says this, quote, "They started with the eradication of Confederate things, including playing and singing Dixie in public, but are expanding to all our American cultural icons. This is only the beginning. Don't believe me? Watching the news leading up to Memorial Day, there have been over a dozen reported incidents of vandalism against U.S. veterans' monuments, Vietnam, Korea, etc., USA flags, and even veteran graves. If allowed to continue, this culture war will eventually destroy every vestige of traditional America. That is their goal, and it won't stop with the South." And that got people fired up on social media because it's true. I mentioned this before. You know, the South is a low-hanging fruit. So we're going to take the flags out of the stained glass at the National Cathedral. We'll pass bills where you can no longer, I mean, you can still go out and put little flags on certain holidays at the national cemeteries, but any other display of the flag is now going to be illegal. So they're going to pick the low-hanging fruit, but the push behind this is something bigger. The push behind this is being driven by the very radical left, and they are not satisfied with just simply getting rid of Confederate flags. That's the easy thing. And there are a lot of well-meaning people who think, okay, well, we'll do that, we'll appease them, and they'll stop there. The fact is they're not going to stop there because, of course, in Vietnam and Korea, you had the United States going to war against non-Western peoples, and even we had the Obama apology tour in Japan. Now you can debate whether the nuclear bombs were necessary. Some people say they are. Some people say they aren't. So this is that's kind of a political historical debate. You can look at the issues there, but it's indicative of the radical left, and it's no coincidence that this took place in a non-Western country. Because, of course, you're going to have the influence of race and culture and America being imperialist. Now, I would agree that America was and still is imperialist, but you don't see people going to Germany and apologizing for landing at D-Day or apologizing for the massive bombing over German targets and cities where thousands and thousands of civilians were killed. You don't see any of that kind of apology. Where civilians were essentially directly targeted. I haven't seen Obama go over there and apologize to the German people, for example. So this is motivated by leftist impulse in regard to non-Western peoples. And you started seeing this in diplomatic history. If you are a diplomatic, study diplomatic history, there was a school of thought that really popped up beginning in the 1960s. It started using, just like every other historical field, race became an important part of diplomatic history, and people started talking about the influence of race in American diplomacy. And of course, there were, if you look at American policy during World War II, for example, the materials that were published about the Japanese people, whether here in America or for the military itself, you'd never see that today. And the way that non-Western peoples were characterized in Korea or Vietnam, you'd never see that characterization today out of the official government propaganda. So this is part of a bigger picture, which is anything the United States has done is bad. I mean, again, just look at the fact that at Trump rallies, for example, people are burning U.S. flags. So this culture war is not just about the South. It's bigger than that. It's about anything that's traditionally American, and it's going to continue because the radical left will not be appeased by simply taking down Confederate flags. I mean, there's an assault on Christianity, for example, in the United States. Maybe one day the cross because of the Crusades. I mean, again, Obama mentioned this. The Crusades were evil, so maybe the Christian cross now will be on the chopping block because that was used for quote unquote evil during the Crusades or oppressing people, whatever the case may be. I mean, this is what we're running into in the United States. So I think it's only a matter of time that other American cultural icons are going to feel the wrath of the radical left. And Mr. McAllister also talks about the fact that he went to Fort McHenry, and now Fort McHenry has to be contextualized, right? So Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, it now has to be contextualized because, of course, he was a slaveholder and he supported colonization. Now, again, I don't see when you go to the Lincoln Memorial a contextualization of the Lincoln Memorial saying that Lincoln's wife was a slaveholder and she had family members fighting for the Confederacy and Lincoln supported colonization even during the war. There's no contextualization there because that's their guy. But anyone that's considered to be maybe somebody else's guy, Francis Scott Key was openly a Southerner, well, then you have to contextualize that person and talk about that type of activity. And so this is typical now. You go to Southern plantations, and nary a mention is made of the great things that these individuals did. It's all about the activities of the labor force, the slave labor force on the plantations, and that's contextualization. You go to Fort Pickens in Florida, and big panels are set up about the labor force used to build the fort. They do, of course, talk about other things, and that's fine. I mean, I think that talking about the entire history of a particular installation like that, how it was built, who was stationed there, et cetera, all that's fine. But when you do it at the expense of the larger picture, that's when it becomes problematic. Telling a whole story is important in history. And then, of course, you have the misreading of a story. For example, Michelle Obama standing up at a graduation and saying that she wakes up every day in a house that slaves built. Well, that's not necessarily 100% true. I mean, there was large numbers of Irish laborers who worked on the White House, on the Executive Mansion, as it was called, worked on that building. And there were slave laborers used, but there was also free black labor used, and a large number of Irish workers used. So it wasn't built exclusively by slave labor. But that's the impression you get, that it was only built by slave labor. So I think it's important that we tell the whole story, but it's also important that we don't over-contextualize something at the expense of the real story. So this is and he concludes by saying, everyone, child, veteran, and citizen alike, who sings the Star-Spangled Banner with their hand over their heart should remember that the dominoes are falling as surely as the bombs burst in the air. And, I mean, it's true. Everything's going to be recontextualized. Every Confederate monument or symbol is going to be contextualized or removed. I mean, I think that's going to happen. But then you're going to start seeing contextualization of other things in American history that you may not expect, and people, I think, may not like. And that's what I've been saying on this podcast. That's what we've been saying at the Institute, whether it's for our conferences on political correctness. This is what it's going to come down to. No one has a problem telling the story, right? And getting everything you can into history. I mean, Southern history is complex. American history is complex, and no one is against that. But when you do when you have the contextualization and you overemphasize something at the expense of the story, that's when it becomes problematic. All right. On Tuesday, we ran a piece entitled "The South Carolina Doctrine." This was actually a portion of a speech that Robert Y. Hayne made in 1832 in the Senate when he was debating Daniel Webster. And since we're having a conference on nullification coming up in August, we'll start running pieces here and there on nullification. This particular piece, it's excellent. His first paragraph is outstanding, and he says this, quote, "Sir, South Carolina has not gone one step further than Mr. Jefferson himself was disposed to go in relation to the present subject of our present complaints. Not a step further than the statesmen from New England were disposed to go under similar circumstances. No further than the senator from Massachusetts himself once considered as within, quote, the limits of a constitutional opposition. The doctrine that it is the right of a state to judge of the violations of the Constitution on the part of the federal government and to protect her citizens from the operations of unconstitutional laws was held by the enlightened citizens of Boston who assembled at Faneuil Hall on the 25th of January, 1809. They state in that celebrated memorial that, quote, they looked only to the state legislature, who were competent to devise relief against the unconstitutional acts of the general government. That your power, say they, is adequate to that object is evident from the organization of the Confederacy." So there's a couple of interesting things there. Number one, I mean, Hayne is correct. Nullification was used in the North quite extensively. And what he's getting into here in 1809, of course, they're talking about the embargo that the Jefferson administration advocated and the Congress passed. And that embargo damaged New England commerce. And so people like Daniel Webster were out running around talking about how the embargo was unconstitutional. They just weren't going to enforce it. And of course, during the War of 1812, they dusted this idea off again. This led to the Hartford Convention and real discussion of secession in Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England. There was also discussion of secession in 1794. The lost part of American history is that the South was the section that had the guts to actually pull it off. The North never really did it. They always backed off. But the South had the guts to do it. And the other lost part of this is that when the Constitution was being ratified, this idea was brought up. What's going to happen if the general government abuses its power? Well, people North and South who favored the Constitution simply said, well, the states can check it then. If the law is unconstitutional, it's no law. Well, who's going to determine that? Nowadays, we think it's the Supreme Court. And even in 1798, when the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were passed, the response from some northern states was that, no, the courts have to decide this issue. And you did have people like Oliver Ellsworth and Oliver Wolcott in Connecticut saying that they believed that there would be a judicial response to that type of problem. But then, what happens if the federal government becomes complicit in this? What happens if the federal court system upholds a blatantly unconstitutional law, like the Sedition Act? What happens if they do that? Then what is your recourse? Well, of course, Jefferson and Madison said it's the states. Someone like Roger Sherman would have said it's the states. Even Oliver Ellsworth said it was the states. And here we have in Massachusetts examples, in Hartford, Connecticut, examples that the North believed it was the states. And even beyond that, when you get to things like the fugitive slave law and what were called personal liberty laws. Now, there is a difference in those, and that is that the fugitive slave law was in the Constitution. So you can debate whether these personal liberty laws were entirely consistent with the idea of nullification, but still the states did it. And as Dr. Livingston said, well, this is a political situation. They're saying to themselves, we believe it's beyond the scope of constitutional power. So the states were determining that. This is what we're going to get into with nullification. And of course, it's not necessarily the legislature that needs to be the expositor of this particular position. It needs to be conventions. It needs to be conventions, because conventions have long been considered to be the voice of the people. And so this is a very short little section of his speech, but he does mention that Daniel Webster agreed with nullification before he disagreed with it in 1832, and that is true. And Webster said in 1809, quote, "This opposition is constitutional and legal. It is also conscientious. It rests on settled and sober conviction that such policy is destructive to the interests of the people and dangerous to the being of government. The experience of every day confirms these sentiments. Men who act from such motives are not to be discouraged by trifling obstacles nor awed by any dangers. They know the limit of constitutional opposition. Up to that limit, at their own discretion, they will walk, and walk fearlessly." And then Hayne rejoins, "How the being of the government was to be endangered by constitutional opposition to the embargo, I leave to the gentleman to explain." And he says, quote, "Thus it will be seen, Mr. President, that the South Carolina doctrine is the Republican doctrine of '98, that it was promulgated by the fathers of the faith, that it was maintained by Virginia and Kentucky in the worst of times, that it constituted the very pivot on which the political revolution of that day turned, that it embraces the very principles, the triumph of which at the time saved the Constitution at its last gasp, and which New England statesmen were not unwilling to adopt when they believed themselves to be the victims of unconstitutional legislation. Sir, as to the doctrine that the federal government is the exclusive judge of the extent as well as the limitations of its powers, it seems to me to be utterly subversive of the sovereignty and independence of the states." This is an excellent speech. And of course, the great tragedy in this Webster-Hayne debate and then later Calhoun-Hayne debate is that Webster actually lost. One of these days I'm going to run the piece that explains this very, very clearly by one of Dr. Wilson's other students, Scott Trask. Explains it very clearly that was the case. That, nowadays we look back and we look at Daniel Webster's very flowery and elegant language, and he was a very good speaker, and say, well, obviously Daniel Webster won the day, but the arguments, even at the time, were on the side of South Carolina, and people recognized that Webster was simply just blowing smoke, and that South Carolina had concrete evidence to say that their position was correct, and that Webster was just a rhetorician. All right, Wednesday we ran part 35 of Sayings by Our Four Southerners. Again, getting into this idea of political correctness, the first quote, "Those haters seem to want to destroy anything and anyone they can tie to slavery. Let's bulldoze the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial." And I mean, that, what's next? Are you going to contextualize those monuments, or are you going to just tear them down? And I think there would be people in the United States who would be willing to just tear them down. Maybe not the Washington Monument, but I think Jefferson could definitely be up for discussion on the politically correct assault on not just the South, but on America. A couple other good ones. I just don't understand why people would choose to go to the Washington and Lee University and then complain about Lee. And Dr. Wilson himself says, people who hate Lee simply can't understand or don't like the concept of a Christian gentleman. One very good one from Jefferson. Speeches that are measured by the hour will die with the hour. That's true. So some very good short little quotations there. All right. Thursday we had a very interesting piece. And something that's a little change of a pace. And it was how and why to dress like a Southern conservative, part 1. Now, I added the Southern part because it's more about just, a conservative. But Southerners did hang on, and it wasn't just tied exclusively to the South, but I think Southerners, tried to hang on to a manner of dress. And if you look at American cultural history, and you look at the South, what you'll find, particularly with Cavalier culture, is that Southerners have long been interested in the manner of dress that displays their status in society. Blue jeans were not worn by Southerners of status until the late 20th century. That was the clothing of workers. Coarse fabrics was the clothing of workers. And so if you were a man of status, you dressed the part. Even if you were not a man of status or a lady of status, you still wanted to dress like you were. The idea is that you never went out looking like you didn't, you weren't proud of who you were, or you didn't respect yourself. And so clothing supported this idea. And so Dan Phillips talks about this, and he says this: the lack of focus on appropriate attire within the traditional conservative circles is unfortunate because I believe aesthetics are an important part of the whole traditional conservative package. Upon consideration, I have concluded that there are two ways to dress that could signal to the world, so to speak, one's conservative leanings, not including simply wearing an NRA or Hillary for Prison or whatever t-shirt. The first, the subject of this essay, would be to consciously make dressing up your baseline public presentation. The second will be subject for part 2. As we will see, today's dressing up was yesterday's routine attire. As a traditionalist conservative, I have developed something of a motto. Quote, if you want to restore the past, you should act like you're living in it. This manner of dressing would follow that logic. He says, I first started thinking seriously along these lines when I read a 2003 article by Jeffrey Tucker. Mr. Tucker makes an important point that most modern Americans miss, since our current norms have been the standard for decades. But much of what people routinely wear today are, by historical standards, work clothes or otherwise not clothes once considered suitable for public presentation. Jeans, for example, used to be exclusively for manual labor, not a fashion statement. This is why cotton khakis are considered casual, a designation that used to confuse me. Since they are not jeans, I, like many others, believe that putting on a pair of khakis constituted dressing up. But historically, this is not the case. Khakis are rightly considered informal, primarily weekend attire, particularly if your day is going to include a lot of outdoor activity. Routine attire would be a wool pant. And so he concludes, why would modern-day traditional conservatives want to rubber stamp a change brought about by countercultural forces that have also contributed to the ruin of our traditional society in many other ways than clothing standards? Perhaps traditional conservatives should instead countersignal, so to speak, our prevailing cultural decline by consciously embracing a manner of dress and norms that characterize a bygone era and still characterize the dress of certain people of a particular station. Since routinely dressing appropriately is so counter to the modern norm, it is a potentially subversive act. When people ask you why you're dressed up, tell them. This could potentially impact a lot more people than writing essays that preach to the choir or campaigning for Republican candidates. or whatever else it is we do to try to restore right order to our civilization in free fall. And that's an interesting point. This is a symbolic thing. Dressing appropriately is symbolic, just as much as symbols, flags, or monuments is symbolic. Not dressing with the, frankly, trashy norms of the day. And, as a younger person, I myself am guilty of going out at times. If I just have to run up to the store or run to go get something somewhere, of not, really paying much attention to what I'm wearing, though I do in my everyday, which is not something that a lot of my colleagues do. I do wear a shirt and tie every day. And I think that's important to do that. And that's going less than what people used to do. I don't wear a jacket every day to class, but I do wear a shirt and tie. It used to be you wear a jacket as well. Because of our climate control system, I often am way too hot to do that. So a shirt and tie works. But this is, it used to be you wore a jacket and a shirt and tie, no matter what the temperature was, and that's how you presented yourself. We are in a situation now in modern America where, trashy has become standard fare. And people do not dress appropriately anytime. And I think that's indicative of, as Dan points out, the prevailing counterculture. It was the counterculture to dress down, so to speak. And that's now become the cultural norm. All right. It's a very interesting little piece. We'll publish part 2 when he gets it done. Now, the last piece is by Lunell McAllister, David McAllister's wife, and she is another very active partisan in Florida. And she has a question: who will be our Monuments Men? And there was a 2014 movie entitled Monuments Men that talked about this American group that went around trying to save art from Nazi thieves. And this is still an ongoing project, trying to rescue stolen art that was captured, by the Nazis during World War II. And Eisenhower himself said, quote, "The good name of the Army depended in great measure on the respect which it showed to the art heritage of the modern world." And so there were 350 men who went out and tried to save these pieces of art. And this is something that she says has been never done before in war, an organized effort to protect symbols of European culture that were in jeopardy of being erased by an organized effort by a regime backed up by its armed forces. The Allies, not including Russia, realized that the preservation of art and culture was part of what they were fighting for. Not just stopping the advance of totalitarianism, but the elimination of cultures targeted for obliteration. To make a better future, they wanted to save, protect, and preserve the culture as portrayed in its art. She says the Monument Men understood the significance of art. Clooney's character in the movie said, quote, "You can wipe out an entire generation. You can burn their homes to the ground, and somehow they'll still find their way back. But if you destroy their history, you destroy their achievements, it's as if they never existed. That's what Hitler wants, and that's exactly what we're fighting for." Think about that. This is what George Clooney said. Now, it's fictional, right? But this is what George Clooney said in the movie, and people cheer that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But what is going on now in America? After 70 years of near obscurity, on U.S. Memorial Day 2014, the men and women of the Monuments Men were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. During the last year of the war and during the post-war years, they recovered more than 5 million artistic and cultural treasures stolen by the Nazis. But then she gets into the real nuts and bolts of this. She mentions that currently in the Middle East there is a concerted effort by ISIS to destroy World Heritage sites. Palmyra, for example, has been targeted for destruction. And there was an archaeologist who was executed because he refused to reveal locations of hidden cultural sites to these ISIS racists. And so she brings up a recent interview with George Clooney again. And he said this, quote, "It's a funny thing. One of the scenes that we were writing and we wrote about, we said if you take their culture away, you can kill them. You can murder their families, but if you take away their culture, that's when society breaks down. I spent a lot of time going through these villages in Sudan and Darfur where it wasn't enough that you killed them and killed their children. You had to destroy the things they had created generations before. You had to destroy what made the village theirs. That was as important as the raping and the murdering of these families. You start to understand. We started to understand how, when we didn't protect the art during the beginning of the war in Iraq, we didn't protect those monuments and those artifacts, and a lot of those things are lost forever. How that can actually affect the community in a very deep way. We learned that lesson again, and we keep relearning how important those things are, how important these pieces are. What are you fighting for if it's not for your culture and your life? It's a hard thing when you're doing a movie, if we're going to write a script about saving art, if it doesn't really sound all that fun. You have to remind people that what we're talking about isn't just these paintings on a wall that some people can look at and get and some can't, but it's also about culture. It is about these monuments and these sculptures. It's also just about the fabric of our culture, and that's what was in our history. It is mankind's way of recording history. So that's a very important part, and that's why the people at the State Department are working very hard at this. So think about the irony in that. She brings it up. Meanwhile, on its own homeland, the United States is tolerating Nazi and ISIS-like acts against the culture and history of a segment of its own people. Various left-wing groups have convinced local and state entities to purge statues, art, and flags of the South from the civil landscape. Monuments from Florida to Texas to the Southern veterans and heroes have been targeted by extremists for removal. Even the Southern historical icon Stone Mountain has been threatened in the Georgia legislature. Clamors to put flags and monuments in museums, and they've got to go, are the slogans of the cultural cleansers. Clooney's words in the interview relating to the current cleansing by ISIS could be quickly reworded for application against the current efforts to purge American culture, especially culture of people who resided in the historical South. And she mentions in this piece that don't feel so safe about the fact that we're just going to put them in a museum. Because even in museums, she brings up a piece I mentioned a while ago in the podcast, how there was a wax museum in St. Augustine where they had to move or get rid of a battle flag behind Jefferson Davis. Well, you can't have that. That's offensive. Some reporter was offended by it, and so now we'll talk about taking that down. They should just tell the reporter, go away. Go agitate somewhere else. Because that's all that is. It's agitation. So would George Clooney stand up in front of the Louisville, Kentucky Confederate Monument and say, hey, wait a second here. Why are we taking this down? This is about culture. Why are we doing this? Or is anyone on the left, any quote unquote reputable historians, I'm not convinced they're very reputable, are they going to stand up and say, wait a second now, we can't do this. Where do we stop? We're going to take down all these monuments? I mean, you're going to eradicate American history. You're going to erase parts of it. Even recontextualization is a move to erase. So where are the monuments men, she questions, in the United States? Where are these people that are saying, wait a second, it's fallen on volunteers, amateurs, people who just want to go out there and they're tired of political correctness, and they're trying to stand up and say, we don't want this anymore. Certainly not all American history is rosy. Certainly not all American history is great. That's history. And if you look at art, not all art is great, but it does preserve a culture. You can say, even if I don't appreciate that work of art, that's a culture that we're trying to preserve, or we should respect anyways. If you truly believe in diversity, even if it offends, And by God, I know that there's a lot of modern art that's funded by the federal government that offends a lot of people, and yet Americans still fork over their tax dollars to fund it. You're paying for things that offend you. In this particular case, these monuments have already been bought and paid for. And so it's not like this is some new exhibit. But, I mean, it's paintings. There have been, in Kentucky, and Kentucky has kind of been ground zero for some of this stuff. There was a painting in Kentucky that was considered to be offensive that was covered up by a university. We can't have that anymore. It's a painting, right? Oh, we'll just paint over parts of it and make it different. Or, I mean, this is exactly what we've done at various times in Western civilization, censorship. Or, here we have these stained glass windows. We got to take out the offensive part. Can't have that. Instead of talking about it, nope, we got to take it out. So it's amazing to me how people believe this will stop. Again, it'll stop in the South. And I don't think that, I think this is going to be a long war, and that more symbols and monuments are going to come down because no one's willing to say enough. And it's unfortunate because at one point, and we're very inconsistent in America, we're willing to say we need to save art and save monuments in Europe. These things are valuable, even if they were, you think about some of the symbols in Europe. Or the pyramids themselves. The pyramids are a symbol of slavery. They were built by slaves, yet we have to save those. We have to save them. I don't see a big, historic marker in front of them saying these pyramids were built by slaves, and then having, the entire process, the entire marker talk about the slave people that built them. Now, we don't do that. But yet, if it's a plantation home in the antebellum South, you got to do that. If it's, if it's a monument to a Southern hero, you have to do that. We'll just take down Confederate monuments and replace them with Tim Tebow, as Marco Rubio wants to do. This is so silly. So, it's not going to stop with the South, and I think people need to realize that. And when they do, when they finally wake up and realize that, it might be too late. The monuments may already be gone. The monuments that they enjoy, the things that they think reflect American culture, that have no stain of racism or anything else, they'll be gone too, because somebody will figure out that there's some type of stain of racism involved in that. There's something there that they don't like. There was discussion about the Louisville, Kentucky monument, taking that down and putting Muhammad Ali up. Well, I guess that's fitting in one way, because Ali, if you say that monument is racist, the Confederate monument, well, Ali was also racist. Just go out and look for his statements on race that he made several times. Muhammad Ali is a fabrication, a myth of the left. There's a real myth. And we've talked about the Lincoln myth and other things. There are so many myths of the left that people just gobble up. Oh, he's the greatest. He's this. My gosh. It's amazing their hypocrisy and their inconsistency. It just, if you really study these things, it's very frustrating. But that's the society we live in, and that's why the Abbeville Institute exists, to try to expose the hypocrisy, expose the lies of the other side, to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, politically, culturally, whatever the case may be. And so, because of that, please, again, consider a donation to the Institute. We exist on your generous contributions, and so if you are so inclined, go to our website, abbevilleinstitute.org, and make a contribution. Until next time, good day.